In today's video, I'll talk about some of the mistakes and some of the omissions that candidates for senior finance roles make while preparing for a job interview, and also comment a little bit on this list. In my opinion, it's inevitable that you'll get asked something about risk or something about exposure to danger, which is the official definition of risk. And here I added a couple of possible questions for you. So beginning with the time when you took a risk in a fast-paced project. So here your potential employer is actually interested in your ability to make quick judgment calls, or also to quote from someone's leadership principles, that's your bias for action. Needless to say, you must think of what's the best possible story you want to use here, and of course put it in a star format. The second, when you took a risk and failed, right? So this would be a failure story. And keep this in mind, we're talking already in a context of risk, which many people already forget preparing for, and a context of failure, which is very unnatural to talk about. So these would be, I think, good enough reasons for you to prepare. In short, failure stories are, if you would want to give them a star format, would be the situation and task, half of the story, the actual situation, the story and the failure until the action, and then the result would be your learnings and how you grew from that experience. And I would also like to highlight here that, especially for senior roles, you shouldn't shy away to talk about negative experiences, learning experiences, in order to advertise on your strengths for your role. When you took are you a risk taker? So this is a broader question. So there's no specific one-size-fits-all answer for these things. So you should really think of a couple of examples that would highlight your ability to take risk and essentially being a rational person. But you should definitely think about these type of scenario. What's the biggest risk that you took? As I previously mentioned, for when you took a risk and failed, here you can either talk about your greatest success, when you took a big risk and why that risk makes sense, but also you can advertise yourself on your failure if you feel comfortable talking about these things. So these would be some of the scenarios, some of the questions you would want to prepare when it comes to risk. The second area you want to take seriously for a job interview, especially for a finance role, is the general types of questions. And I know that it should go without saying that everyone should prepare these things. However, I just wanted to make a quick reminder here on what's interesting to prepare for. Why this company? So why this company? I have other videos in case you need some pointers, but the idea is that you must prepare something concise and convincing, and even multiple versions depending on who your interviewer will be, or what's their area of activity, or what's their role in the hiring process. So you should consider various scenarios if you want to take your answers to the next level. Why you? It's often related. You can also link one good answer for both of these two. What's your strength and what's your weakness? Your strength is something that is pretty well known in HR, that we say you should always focus on your strengths throughout your interview. So if you know that one thing that sets you apart from other candidates, you should definitely keep that in mind and advertise on it throughout the conversation. Of course, when it comes to the weakness, that's also something not only that might get asked for such a role, but also something you would want to be very careful with, especially if there's you have a lot of other candidates applying for the same job. So I also have other videos on my channel if you want to investigate how you find your weakness and examples of weaknesses, even if you're interested. Tell me about one of your projects. Now, you should also learn to read through the lines here. If someone asks you these types of general question, you should always talk about some highlights, your best possible project. Even if they ask you for the last project you worked on, if you worked on your most exceptional project 1 year ago, but you still have some something to do with that work, you should definitely use that one. So advertise on what's most interesting for you. So definitely keep in mind this scenario. Tell me about yourself. This is also the favorite question to ask at the beginning of an interview, and I've had cases where people had 6 rounds of on-site interviews, and each and every round began with, tell me about yourself. So needless to say, you want to take these general types of questions seriously, and even go as far as to prepare 2 versions for these, especially for tell me about yourself. So this will be the advice for the general types of questions. Working with data might sound like straightforward, right? So we do this every day. However, when it comes to data in certain scenarios, specifically in an ambiguous environment where decisions are not straightforward to make, that's where, the challenge in communication arrives. So I added here a couple of questions, such as a time when you had to make a decision without having all the necessary data, which is one of the easier ones, or how do you deal with ambiguity? This is another one that's pretty general, and that's why I would encourage you to think about what are the main stories that you would want to use during the interview, and ensure that you have some very good ones with ambiguity, because why would they ask you for these questions? Because they want to see your judgment, how you make decisions, and it's basically also linked with the previous section with the risk taking part, but these are different inflection points into that conversation. When you analyze something complex, this is another one that it's pretty straightforward once you have the best possible story to talk about. When you convince someone of something using data. Now here, as a quick side note, it's pretty straightforward to find something, some numbers to come up with and to basically convince someone of something. But there are 2 reasons why someone would ask you this. First of all, they want to see if you have genuine experiences of these scenarios. And the second reason is they want to see also your interpersonal skills. So whenever you're talking about working with someone, talk about also the data, but talk about also your interpersonal skills and your ability to earn their trust ultimately, because that's what convincing is all about. And finally, a more special type of question, a metric that you identified, that you designed to improve on something. This one, from experience, it can be a bit tricky to come up with on the spot, so that's why I also included it here, so maybe you have a little bit of time to prepare the best possible story. Number 4, failure stories. I know I touched upon this briefly in my previous sections, but I wanted to really take a little bit of time to highlight some key elements that you might not be aware of when it comes to behavioral interviewing. So failures are something that are really trending as a topic in behavioral interviews these days. So I know from experience, especially if you've never prepared for failure stories or for behavioral interviews, that it will take you between 1 and 3 examples until you get to a proper failure story. A good failure story is usually a quantifiable one that also contains metrics, only the relevant metrics, of course, and it's often concise, to the extent that you can communicate that concisely. Furthermore, I would encourage you to prepare 5 stories, 5 failures in your career, especially if you're applying for a more senior role. Even for junior roles, I would encourage candidates to prepare at least 3 failure stories, because I know that they're not natural to prepare for. So I know the more you think about them, the better you'll refresh your memory on, and the more comfortable you'll feel about them. There's also tricks when it comes to fitting those failure stories into the STAR method. First, keep in mind the STAR method is a template, so it's just something you should follow once you have your message communicated clearly. But if you would want to put a template into this failure story, then the situation and the task and the action would contain your actual failure. So when you had a business that flopped after 3 years and you wasted $3 million, So this is the situation, task, action, and the result would be your learnings, what you learned from that, and eventually, maybe that business evolve into something else if you want, but keep in mind the results are something you would want to allocate 50% of the total time you would allocate for communicating that failure story. So this would be some of the main pointers. I will also link some videos in the video description with more help when it comes to crafting the best possible failure stories. And finally, just a few words on branding. I believe that branding does actually matter, especially for finance roles. And I believe branding should be something you should take seriously after you prepare, the behavioral part of the interview. After you have the content, the stories you would want to communicate during the job interview, then you must also work a little bit on how you communicate those. And the main reason why I'm saying this is because I've seen through time, by coaching other candidates for these roles, that you have to be a great communicator, and you have to. Being a great communicator doesn't only mean that you have a great idea to communicate, but you should also communicate in a way that it's memorable. So whatever your style might be, some people prefer to just throw it out there. Some people prefer a more discreet approach, but think about what your style, and try to take this style to the next level for your interviewing experience. And last, about your look, I found that for finance role, I'm not telling you to be too formal in an interview, but I'm telling you that the look in the interview does actually matter. Now, what is the look that you prefer? That very much depends on the company that you're applying for, but usually for finance roles, you have to be a bit more formal than for other roles. Of course, you should be yourself. I encourage you to act like yourself, but still, I believe the branding is a relevant area that you should take into account going into a behavioral interview for a finance role.